Clementine's mind was clouded, and her body felt numb when she returned to the group with Sarah. Leaving two more friends behind was just about the same time was taxing on her, no matter how strong she set herself back up to be. Next to her, the older girl walked quietly, her empty gaze set straight ahead. Her face was completely expressionless. Her fingers curled around Nick's bloody hat like if the wind would carry it away at any moment. "Are you?" Clementine began, eyeing her friend carefully. However, Sarah simply turned her head in response, the look on her face unlike Clementine had ever seen before. Sarah looked hardened, like a bit of Play-Doh let out in the open too long. Her soft exterior seemed to stiffen, and solidly, the depth of the emotion with her eyes was much deeper. She was not broken, but something had been destroyed. All the same, from Luke and Nick's deaths, eyes that looked back at Clementine were foreseen. Those of someone she'd never seen before, almost like a complete stranger. It was a bit frightening. "How did you do it?" the older girl asked quietly. "Back when Luke was attacking me, all I could think of was, he's gone. He's one of those things now, and it consumed me. I couldn't even think to shoot because I was too sad. How could you think and look at the past, Dad, and shoot him?" The answer was simple, and it had something Clementine had thought of too often. It wasn't too much to be looking past it, but rather forgetting it was temporarily. "I learned that a long time ago to clear my mind when things that happened the way it did. I can grieve and feel sad later, but in that moment when you were in danger, I had to do something," she explained. "You needed to clear your mind off of any emotions at that moment and make the decision based on keeping yourself and the others safe." "I see." Sarah's voice trailed off as she mustered her friend's words, half-lidded eyes scanning through the cold world around them. There seemed to be something she wanted to say, but her mouth hovered open, and with not a word, pushed past her lips. She ran a hand through her back of her hair and shook her head, fists curling tightly. That was so hard to do. Clementine knew what she was referring to and didn't dare to mention Nick's name. It's always hard, but he would have been a walker otherwise. "So you saved him, Sarah?" She was a bit surprised that Nick was so hell-bent into having Sarah put him down, but she supposed that it might have been pushed her in the right direction at the end anyway. It was so hard for someone to adapt in the world, and Sarah especially seemed to be struggling. Troy and Mike made some progress with her by teaching her how to shoot, but Nick caused another leap of maturity in her being her first mercy kill. It wasn't the smooth path to adulthood, but lacking the usual awkwardness and indolences had replaced it with a painful, bitter feeling that crushed one's heart and made emotions difficult to feel anymore. Clementine herself struggled to keep herself from shutting down and closing the world off, and in hope that somewhere in the little girl she once was still resided in her. "Yeah, I feel like a hero," Sarah mumbled, the rest of her feelings clearly indicated by her jaded expression. Yes, it was clear that Sarah was now learning how to leave her child personality behind. As much as it sucked, it was the only way to survive. Clementine wondered what Carlos would think now, but she had hoped that he would be the least happy that she was going to be safer, harder, but more bitter, but definitely safer. Once the two girls entered back in the abandoned house, they were both greeted with the image of the adults once again, huddled by the fire, this time with blankets they found. Everyone looked exhausted, the effects of deaths of everyone in the group catching up to them all. Clementine herself felt like the shadow was constantly following her, whispering all those lost loved ones' names. She settled herself down next to Kenny, nodding that AJ was now wrapped up in more blankets and asleep in the man's arms. "We found some baby food here too. This place was fully stocked," Kenny murmured quietly, smiling Clementine's times away. "I guess Rusky didn't lie to us after all." Expressing the urge to narrow her eyes at the moment, Clementine merely nodded, dragging her legs to meet her chest. She suddenly felt so small, so helpless, but at the same time she knew how hollow the feelings would fade. It would still be there, of course, but eventually the chaotic smoke clouding her mind would dissipate into something manageable. For now she simply sat there, curled up tightly, and tried to tune out the rest of the world, Unfortunately, it didn't work so well, with the adults thinking all around her. She didn't have to engage in the conversations. At least still she couldn't help but listen to her hushed words as her mind grew more and more clouded with exhaustion. We really need to think about what we're doing and where we're going. I mean, with Nick and Luke gone, we're really dwindling, Kenny said. Less mouths to feed, at least, Troy pointed out. There was a heavy pause, and Clementine felt a bit amused to glare at the others, if not for him, for the cruelty of his words. Not that those two kicking it was good or nothing, he added hastily. Can't do nothing about them now, but God, all those we've lost along the way, it's getting harder, Bonnie admitted, more hint of sadness in her tone. For AJ's safety, it's our priority, Kenny rasped. If nothing else, we gotta make sure this little guy grows up. One more or less murmured in agreement. The idea of AJ surviving, at least able to gain survival skills, their only option, but warning something was meaningless without putting a plan to action to achieve it. I know I said it before and y'all didn't like it, but we probably should consider going back to Howe's, Bonnie pointed out. Hear me out. Without Bill, it could work. Maybe fixing it up a little bit, sure, but we sure got enough folks to make it functional again. Not a bad idea. AJ could grow up safe behind the walls, Jane reasoned, crossing her arms. Kenny shot her a quick glare and shook his head. No, Wellington is a safe place. You can all backtrack if you like, but I know where I'm going with AJ. He ain't your kid, Mike snapped. Why not go what's best for him? Funny, I thought I was going back to Howe's would be stupid, but for all we know, the place could have been ransacked and destroyed already, or at least taken over by another group. Kenny scowled, pausing to take a deep brief sigh through his nose. But I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Say we go back and try to live there again. Do you really think there is a certain asshole here that would let the leftovers of that environment get to his thick head? The words all sunk in for at least 2 seconds before everyone shot eyes to Troy, who promptly grew red in the face from embarrassment or anger. Clementine didn't know. He certainly sounded furious when he responded. Are you fucking kidding me? Christ, I wanted just to live there and safe just for you all do. Mike couldn't help but chuckle, lightening the mood of the room for a moment. Okay, listen. I'll play the devil's advocate here. Kenny may have a point. But are you even saying you're going to stick around, Troy? Troy blinked. What do you mean? Well, are you staying or going? I seem to recall you saying you'd stay with us as long as you can get back on your feet. So you seem fine to me now, so what's keeping you? Mike didn't sound accusingly, but it was just a welcoming tone either. It wasn't. Another brief of silence fell amongst them, and Clementine almost thought she had managed to fall asleep with her eyes open, but the crackling of the fire could still be heard, and the subtle of the wind blowing outside of the house, not to mention the creaks of the wood as people shifted in their seating positions. I don't know, Troy muttered finally, almost whispering, but I figure there ain't anything better out there for me. Mike chuckled under his breath. I think that's in case for most folks these days. That is why we can't go back to Howe's. It's just assholes swelled heads like you that run it. Kenny barked, and Clementine just sat up abruptly, giving on the sleeping for the time being. It just wasn't worth it to try to see what was clearly conflict to come. She rubbed at her eyes, exhaustion still trying to drag under her. Do we have to do this now, after all that's happened? She did the quick math in her head, recounted the survival members they had combined with Kenny's group, plus Troy. They had once been 11 stronger. Clem's right, Mike chimed. We don't need this now, and I don't think Troy would be a problem if we did end up going back to Howe's. We could easily overpower him. I don't care. We ain't going back, so there is no need to even debate it, Kenny said. Everyone let out quiet sighs, clearly too exhausted and defeated by the recent events to argue at the moment. Then again, Kenny was a headstrong. Clementine doubted anyone would ever be able to fight him off or change his mind. If he ever wanted to get AJ to Wellington, there was no doubt in her mind that he would, one way or another. Okay, fine, we won't talk about that right now, Mike muttered. But if there's something we need to figure out, then we're letting Arvo go, he pointed, over his shoulder to the team once more, tied to the staircase. When? We're what? Kenny echoed harshly. Sarah cleared her throat quietly. Clementine had almost forgotten that she was right next to her. Sarah hadn't said anything during the time at Howes or Troy's conversation on topics, but clearly wanted her to voice her thoughts. Do you have to fight over Arvo like he's not even in the room? He ain't a part of our group, Troy pointed out. Neither were you until I decided to bring you along, Clementine snapped. All right, you got me there. Clementine rolled her eyes. Idiot. I'm a little worried about Arvo, Sarah admitted, biting her nails thoughtfully. Without a warning, she stood up and approached the teen by the staircase. How are you feeling? She asked him, examining him gently. From what Clementine could see, his head was lowered and his eyes were half-lidded. Upon a closer look, he seemed to be shivering, his slight whimpers almost drowned out by the chattering of his teeth. Sarah didn't hesitate to press her hand against his temple, and drawing back her hand in surprise. He's burning up, she declared, eyes widened. Clementine blinked, stepping closer to the pair. Arvo, are you okay? She asked quietly. She didn't expect an answer, and it was a stupid question in retrospect, but the teen simply just gave a trembling nod. He sure didn't look okay, but something had told her and the others in the room that they may have affected his decision to tell the truth. We do have any antibiotics left, or did Troy use them all? Sarah asked, turning to direct the question to anyone who would know the answer. Troy shrugged. I took another before we left the power plant, and I feel fine. Those work like a charm, I'll tell you. We may have a few of them left in one of the packs. Great, Clem, can you hand me one? Sarah had requested. With a nod, Clementine moved to the open to her supply backpacks, but Kenny held out a hand to place on her arm. It wasn't an aggressive gesture, but it didn't make her feel as if though she would be able to grab the medicine. Jesus, not you too, Clem, Kenny sighed in exasperation and clearing his voice. Don't fall for a sick act. This kid's plotting something, obviously. That Sarah, of all people, shot Kenny a sharp look. You can't be serious, she murmured, frowning and furrowing her brow. She clearly didn't necessarily look angry, merely disappointed, and looked somewhat reminiscent of Sarita, come to think of it. Kenny seemed to notice the similarity too. Or was it just startled Sarah's forwardness? He hesitated before responding, but finally retorted, I am serious. Don't trust his kind. Remember his friends tried to kill us? No, one's forgotten that, Kenny, Bonnie hissed, narrowing her eyes. But you have to admit it, you were being way too tough on the kid. I mean, look at me. Look at Troy. Troy snorted, looking offended. Excuse me? What the fuck's that mean? We ain't exactly known for having always good moral compass. Hell, we don't even still know where yours is looking. Bonnie then rolled her eyes once she saw Troy open his mouth to reply, and cut him off immediately. My point is that he's being awfully harsh to Arvo, considering that he's got two people who work for Bill right here. And besides that, Arvo ain't much older than Sarah and Clem. What's the difference between three of them? Kenny scowled. I know Clem for one, and neither is the little girl's killed Sarita. Sorry, Arvo choked, shaking his head. I no want to kill. Really, my sister. I've got enough of you crying about your damn sister, Kenny roared, practically shoving Arvo into Bonnie's arms, marching over to the teen. You could have not attacked us. You could have left us alone and kept on your merry frickin' way. But no, you all choose to shoot at us. And now you're whining because were some casualties. Arvo closed his eyes, his breath hitching. Then please what? Do you have to speak the English for me to understand, boy? Kenny roared. He stomped his foot in front of the cowering Arvo, looking more like a monster than Clementine had ever seen. Please, Arvo choked out, snot and tears trailing down his face as he lifted his head. Then please kill me. He then met Kenny's angry gaze on head, his eyes wide but clear. He seemed to be widened from the crying and pleading, but it seemed that he finally found clarity, even while sick. The room felt silent, Clementine holding her breath as she flickered on the gaze between Kenny and Arvo. The tension crawled around them, and just the air thick and stifling, and no one ever moved or even breathed out of place. Just by a quick glance at the others, everyone seemed wide-eyed and frozen while they sat. What do you mean? Sarah finally whispered. Why do you want to die, Arvo? His voice trembled a bit, but it was loud and he held anger. Clementine hadn't heard before. If I no use, what good? Without, I can't be, I don't want to be. Tears then pooled behind his cracked glasses as he hung his head. Please, can't live without my sister. Please. Clementine's heart broke in all his hopeless tone. Her stomach was twisting at the similarity of someone not wanting to continue living. Kenny is stunned to see by Arvo's desperation. His mouth hanging open without any hint of reply to utter. He simply stared at the teen, eyes wide. If Clementine didn't know better, she would have thought that he had seen a scene like this before. And hell, who really knew? Maybe he did. Arvo seemed to be crumble all at once, his shoulders trembling as he choked out quiet sobs. Kill me, he repeated, over and over, until he ran out of breath. All of his crying tired him out. He seemed that he was dragged under exhaustion to an uncomfortable sleep. No one in the room moved without a care, afraid to wake him. Everyone looked in the room and the other in silence, their eyes saying no more than their mouths ever could. One by one, they made their way back to the fireplace. Their main source of warmth was dying out. Jane kneeled down in front of it, sparkling some logs with her lighter again. Though the fire refreshed itself, the room still had an eerie chill to it. Once they were seated again, Bonnie posed a question. Listen, y'all, I think we should all have a talk about what to do with the poor kid. Now, we all know he wants to die. No, Mike interjected, tone harsh, tired. Absolutely not. I'm not suggesting we should, Bonnie argued. I'm merely saying, look, maybe we should take a vote. Seriously? Sarah asked, voice noticeably stronger. You can't expect us to vote on something like that. She's right, Clementine muttered in agreement. You are aware that's something Carver would do, aren't you? Bonnie seemed stricken by that, avoiding the other's gaze and murmuring, I know, but sometimes this was all we gotta do. If I'm voting, then no, of course, if we do decide to vote. I like to think we all vote no, Clementine shot back. Jane then shook her head, scoffing under her breath. No offense, but you have to be that naive to think that, Clem. If the kid wants to die, then he'll keep slowing us down until we add dare to his request. But if we get it out of the way, we won't have to deal with him for long. You gotta be frickin' kidding me, Mike growled under his breath. He's sick, Jane. I don't exactly think he's a great state of mind right now. And even if he was, I just can't behind it. I can't. It's just bullshit. Kenny didn't weigh in yet, which had surprised Clementine a bit. The older man took a long, deep breath and said, Never mind. What do you all think? Just to see where we stand? Mike, Sarah, Bonnie, and Clementine already had voiced their own thoughts. Jane suggesting fulfilling Arvo's wish to tie up the loose ends, but strangely Troy didn't weigh in. The man seemed to squirm in his seat, avoiding any eyes on him, studying the ground. Well, Mike prodded lightly. It's not like you gotta be quiet about those things, Troy, or anything really. I don't know, Troy mumbled, oddly nervous and twitchy. I don't frickin' know, okay? Don't count on me on this. I just don't want any part of it. It seemed to startle those as they'd been the only ones. Troy was an angry, trigger-happy guard, all too eager to smack young girls and abuse his power back at Howe's. He probably would have been in the favor of putting Arvo down, to rid of the group of the weak, and the image of selfish asshole was fairly accurate, of course, but Clementine had the misfortune, to see the other side of him. It made all too much sense now, but really, a convenient callback to Troy's drunken ranting back the other night. Seeing someone so utterly broken after losing a family member so much that they completely shut down and just wanted to die. While Troy's reaction spoke for itself. You don't want to be a part of our decisions? That doesn't prove a high position in this group, Troy, Jane points out with a smirk. Or has the guard dog lost its teeth? Clementine rolled her eyes. Jane had been there that night and overheard the last little bit of Troy's pity party and knew why he was reluctant to give an opinion. Why did she insist at poking at people's wounds? Or was it some sort of twisted exposure therapy? Whatever it was, Troy didn't appreciate it. Narrowing his eyes, he growled. Look, I just don't feel like it. I don't care what we do, but I suggest we get some shut-eye in before dawn comes around. Clocks may not be working anymore, but the sun went down a little while ago. Kenny nodded and the conversation's redirection welcome. Fine, not like we're gonna decide something like this tonight anyway. Mike shook his head, anger flashing in his eyes. I can't believe we're waiting on the decision to execute someone. You're all freaking insane. She just had to agree with that, as putting someone down who was bitten sounded a lot like Carver's way. Arvo wasn't convenient for them. He was, as Jane would put it, a liability or a danger, but they were all people. And as long as they were alive, didn't that count for something? No one really reacted to Mike's outburst, save for Bonnie placing a hand on his shoulder. It's okay. We'll just talk more in the morning. No one's deciding anything rash, she assured quietly. Whatever, I'll get first watch. I'm just pissed enough to stay away all night if I have to, Mike snapped, shrugging it off and storming away towards the other side of the room. Clementine couldn't really blame him for being angry. Kenny sighed, shaking his head, and gave a long glance towards Arvo. Traces of sympathy reflected on his expression, his sad eyes and his lips in a slight frown. Clementine didn't understand how long he could have changed his mind so quickly about Arvo. Perhaps the reminder of the teen was indeed human, that was all they needed. It was a refreshing perspective to see Kenny consider, as he had been so unstable lately. When she settled down for sleep, she couldn't help but think that Lee would have liked Kenny regaining some of his empathy. It gave Clementine a sense of something like into hope. Clementine awoke to muffled a shriek and immediately woke up, almost expecting another Walker version of Luke to be in her face. But no, the sky outside still looked dark, and all the girl curled up fast asleep. Clementine almost ruled that there was an animal outside, and that she nearly went back to sleep herself, but a nagging feeling kept her awake. The same instinct made her swipe her gaze around the room, as she realized a few of the group members were missing. Her half-asleep self didn't really register who wasn't around. Just the members were off and the group seemed smaller than usual, even without Nick and Luke. Blinking through her sleepiness, she yawned and dragged herself to the feet, curiosity getting the better of her. Cautiously, she peeked down the front entrance of the shelter. The wind blew gently outside, the brilliant white snowflakes contrasting the black night sky. It was almost hypnotizing in a way. The scenery was beautiful, reminiscent for the Christmas Eve night, with all of its white and peaceful quiet, as it just continued to tranquil regardless of what was going on about. The world became completely falling apart, and hell, it actually was, and it would still look goddamn beautiful. She wished the others could see it, but she didn't dare to wake them just to look at the world outside. Besides, they'd seen enough snow and ice recently anyway. For now, she was content on observing, finally catching a quiet moment to recollect herself. Nick and Luke were heavy losses to the group, not to mention that they were good friends, and their absences could have been physically felt. Everyone seemed quieter, emptier, really like life had drained from them. With a heavy sigh, she tried to get them lost in the image of the snow, attempting to will away all the pain memories of the past few days, but it was difficult to concentrate. She tried to be on her toes all times, anyways getting distracted just went as her instincts. Another sound tore through her attention completely from the scene. This time it was a groan, and quieter and clearly human, prompting her to cautiously step back up and pace towards the origin of the noise. As she carefully stepped over the sleeping bodies, she clearly wondered idly where their watch was. If Clementine was able to make her way towards the front of the home without spotting Mike even once, he clearly wasn't doing a good job of watching. Actually, once she looked closer, she realized that he wasn't anywhere to be found at all. Had something happened? Worry seemed to be running into her mind until she heard the sound of a hushed voice, alerting her that something was in the backyard of their shelter. Were they being attacked? Grabbing both her pistol and hatchet, Clementine cautiously crept through the small house, being careful to avoid the squeaky floorboards. Nearly everyone was curled up by the fire, but she couldn't be too hasty to sneak out to the back. Clementine tightened her grip on her weapons, fully expecting to find an intruder or a walker. But once she finally took a step into the snow, she was face to face with the sight of Arvo, Mike, and Sarah, all in the midst of tiptoeing through the backyard area. "What the hell is going on?" Clementine hissed quietly, her eyes widened and furious, whipping her head and glare at Sarah in particular. She demanded once more where they were doing, no longer caring about being quiet. There was a heavy pause giving Clementine time to look at the scene before her. Arvo had been limping and was now in a hissing and a rushing under his breath, clearly in pain from his jerky movements. He had come to a halt beside Mike, leaning slightly against the man's taller frame for support. Even in the snowy weather, he did notice his eyes seem a bit clearer and his face less flushed, making her believe he had taken something for his fever, and 3 of their heads had been low, like cats caught beside an empty canary cage. Sarah in particular looked stunned, her eyes and wide mouth open agape as in shock. She fumbled with her words, stammering out the fractions of the sounds to try to explain herself. But before she could get a word out, Mike turned to face Clementine and spoke in a clearer voice than she had never heard from him. "We're leaving. Kenny's not thinking clearly, and that's just dangerous, especially for Arvo. And I can't be in a group that seriously considers executing a kid. I just can't do it." Clementine blinked, taking the notes of guns that both Mike and Arvo had at their sides. If she tried to stop them, would they shoot her? She swallowed hard, steeling herself ready and be strong and confident when she replied. "Is this really the only way?" she asked coolly, crossing her arms. "You know if you'll leave your tracks, what if Kenny decides to go after you?" "Snow still fall," Arvo argued, with a shake of his head pointing to the sky. "It's enough time to cover footprints." She blinked considering the answer. It was true. The snow would be enough to replace the tracks, but she somehow didn't put it past Kenny to have her super Floridian tracking skills or something. As familiar as she thought she was with the man, there was still a lot of him that she didn't know. He was seeming more like a stranger since they have reunited, but she didn't blame the time for hardening him. "What about you, Sarah?" she demanded, failing to keep the hurt from her tone. "You leaving us? Leaving me? After everything?" Sarah's eyes widened, and she shook her head, obviously. No, I'm not leaving Clem, I promise. I woke up just to check on Arvo, and I saw Mike untying him. I offered to give him some medicine to leave with." Clementine felt her fists tightened and at their sides. "But why?" she whispered. "Like I said, we can't stay here. They'll kill him, or at least deny him medicine." Mike pressed. "I'm sorry, but some of these supplies are ours too. Hell, most of them are his to start with." He nodded towards Arvo. It angered them to see them leave, but Clementine knew she was powerless to stop them. Well, in fury she could go wake up the others, but she was still in a bit of worry of the guns that Mike and Arvo held, as well as they would be desperate enough to fire them. Should they be threatened? Clementine didn't seem to find out or test them. "You're not taking any of AJ's things, are you?" she asked, but couldn't help. "No, of course not," Mike promised. "We're not taking anyone's guns or anything. Either it's all of this extra shit, you won't even know what it's missing." "Kenny will." She wanted to argue, but it was pointless. Mike had clearly made up his mind, and she couldn't really say that this was the wrong choice. If they wanted to leave, who was she going to prevent that? "If you made up your mind, I can't stop you," she finally said with a shrug, nodding towards Mike and Arvo. There wasn't much she could do, alone apart from causing even more chaos in their group thinning by alerting the others. "Thanks, Clem," Mike replied, generally looking grateful, "and good luck." Clementine didn't respond back to him and turned to Sarah instead. "You're really not going with them?" she asked, just to make sure. "I promise I'm not," Sarah insisted, biting her lip. "But please don't be mad, Clem. I want to help people. It's the least I can do, after I was useless to help Nick and Luke." Clementine pursed her lips, knowing that her friend wasn't useless, but wasn't in the mood to argue. Truthfully, though, she wasn't angry with Sarah. Her friend had been someone in trouble, and it had been her nature to aid them, and even if she was giving away some group's resources. She would never thought Mike was a bad person or Arvo, really, and truly wished them well wherever they went. She just wished that there was an easier way to cut ties. Still, Mike had a good point. In a way of merely taking some of their fair share of supplies and nothing more, they didn't take any weapons from them, nor of any of AJ's foods and blankets. It was merely 2 members living on their own accord and taking the rightfully what belonged to them. Not that big of a deal, but the more she thought about it. Back when she first met Lee, before they found the motor inn, Glenn had been considered part of their new group, and then left to aid his family, taking what he needed to do so. Clementine hardly saw any of the difference now. It didn't strike her as much as the surprise as it happened either. She let herself feel sad for at least Mike's absence, but deep down she had a hunch that this was coming. The group stretched like a rubber band. Sooner or later, someone had to snap and leave. It was only natural. Unfortunate, but natural.